tell the audience a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, so I'm Kiani. I am a podcaster. I'm the host of the Grow to Be Free podcast, which is a self-development podcast focused on helping young, ambitious women learn how to pursue their dreams while finding peace and maintaining a strong mental health. And I'm also an account manager at a marketing agency called Stack Agency. So been working in marketing for about 5 or so years, but I have a real passion for self-development and helping other people learn how to develop themselves into becoming the best versions of themselves. So that's a little bit about who I am.
So helping young women really, find peace and also be successful. Like, what inspired you to want to help young women, and why that specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really stems from my own personal story and some of the things that I went through growing up, particularly in college. So you and I both know you're a part of College Works Painting, which was an incredible internship that allows you to learn how to run your own painting business. And so that was kind of like the first step for me to really figure out, oh, okay, like, first of all, I'm super ambitious. I want to do a lot of things. I want to be successful, all of these things I learned about myself in that internship. And I was like, okay, great. Like, let me pursue success like super duper hard. And it was in that period of time in college and then a little bit after college where I just started to really burn myself out. And I reached a breaking point a little bit after college at like 22, 23. And I realized that it was so hard on me and I didn't really get super far. Like, I learned so many important things about business, about success, about mindset, all of these things, but yet I was still in a place where I was unhappy. I was mentally in a rut. I was depressed, anxious, all the things. And also, diving into behaviors that were self-destructive, like drinking, drugs, sex, all the things that just really exacerbated the problem at the end of the day. And it was at that time that I started to get into more self-development. And I had a friend, her name is Rachel. She introduced me to the Law of Attraction, that book. I read that book. That helped me to realize that I didn't have to stay there. I didn't have to stay in that mindset. I didn't have to stay in the place of darkness, that I can actually help myself get out of that just through changing my mindset. So that's when I started to really start to develop my own positivity skills and start to really focus on my own joy and inner peace. And since then, I've really started to prioritize peace for myself. And since then, I've really been able to turn my life around. And on top of that, like I started to go back to church. I found my faith, or rededicated my life to Christ. And that also added on to the self-development for me, because I started to grow in a bunch of different areas. And now I feel so passionate about it, because it's something that's really helped me get from a dark place to a really amazing place. And I wouldn't have traded those skills or traded those experiences for anything. And now I just feel like there's so much that I can share and so much that I can pull from other women or other people to share on my podcast that can help other women learn how to grow and learn how to not be stuck in a place. Because there's nothing that breaks my heart more than seeing a woman, or just anybody in general, stuck in a place and they don't know how to get out. Like, that's so sad to me. So if I can provide something of value that can help them get out of that place in a little way, then I feel like I've done the world a service. So yeah.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, I think that's really powerful, helping not only just, realizing that you were in a place of depression, anxiety, and then you getting out of it, but also having the almost like the passion to help other people do the same thing. So I'm kind of curious about that, though. I'm sure you heard, like, you can't really help someone that doesn't want to be helped, so do you find that as you're like talking about this, there's certain types of people that are just not ready to receive your message yet?
100%. Yeah, I think there's so much truth to that statement. And I've had several people that I've come across, whether they be friends or acquaintances, who I've tried to help. And you start to realize that they have a mindset that isn't going to allow them to progress or to grow. And for those types of people, I've typically just shown them love and given them as much love as I possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, tested the waters, given them a little bit of advice that has helped me, and seen what they did with it, whether it be in that moment or, you know, by the next week or in a few months. If there hasn't really been too much progression, then you kind of know, like, oh, they might not be ready for it yet, but
Mm-hmm.
it's still valuable to share that with somebody, because you never know, they might wake up one day and realize, like, oh shoot, like, I remember what that girl told me one time,
Mm-hmm.
and that makes sense now. You know, it might not have
Right.
made sense in the moment, but then it makes sense like a few years later, and that seed was still planted, you know? So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's always valuable to share things, even if somebody isn't quite ready.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that to be the case too. Like we're all at different sort of places in our journey. And so some of us might not be like for example, myself, I remember first thing that comes to mind was back in CollegeWorks. CollegeWorks kind of like had us read the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, all about productivity, all about, mindset, being more effective with your time. I read the book and I wasn't ready to receive it yet. I was still immature. And so I actually read it last year, like towards December. And it hit a lot different this time around, years later, because I'm actually ready to receive it now. And, I have a need for that. So yeah, I totally agree. So do you, let's kind of break down a little bit more about like what you did to get out of it, out of that rut and anxiety. You mentioned like reading the book Law of Attraction. Rachel referred it to you. Is that it? Is that all you did? You read the Law of Attraction and suddenly, you were out of it, or what else did you do besides that?
Oh, absolutely not. It was honestly, I still feel like it's a journey even to this day. I mean, now I'm 26 and probably read the Law of Attraction 4 years ago at this point. So I think that was just kind of like an open door, right? Like I read it and it just kind of opened my eyes to a different concept, or, some new concepts that I could start to try out. And, I started to test them out for myself and start to figure out, okay, like this, like having more of a positive mindset or positive perspective about a certain situation will help me to start feeling better. So that was kind of like the first step, like, is, how can I be more positive on my day to day? I think that was kind of like step one for me, because it's in such a dark spot.
Mm-hmm.
And then it started to be more about habits and getting myself out of bed, because I had this very bad habit of, after I'd come home from work, I would turn on Game of Thrones and I would just binge watch it for like until the wee hours of the night, like that was like my routine, and I had no desire to do more than that. I think partially just because of like the depression, but also because of just, it feels so comfortable, right? It feels so comfortable to like come home, and especially after a long day at work that is new to you, and you've used a lot of brain power to learn a bunch of things during the day. You're just so exhausted that that's kind of all you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But once I started to break myself out of that cycle and start investing into other things, like I already knew I was so ambitious, like what was the new thing that I was going to pursue, right, outside of my job. And so I started to get into more books and started to read more books. I started to look at courses and try to figure out, okay, like what is it that I want to be doing outside of my job? Because I knew, just being out of job isn't something for me. So how am I going to start getting out of that? So it was really just like a period of three or so years where I started to just build new habits and start
Mm.
to have new inputs. Like I got some coaching done, and like those coaches really did help me change my mindset a lot. And so that was kind of the next step of like, now I'm leveling up my mindset and starting to build newer and better habits that were going to feed my growth. And so it was just kind of a snowball effect from there, I would
Mhm.
say. And it's always a practice too. So after I started to get some coaching, I started going back to church, and I started to learn a little bit more about my own self-worth and start to develop that. And especially for women, I think self-worth is an area where we struggle in, just, from being little and going all the way up into old age.
Hmm.
And when I started to learn about how worthy I am just from a godly perspective, it started to translate into other areas of my life. And I can really say that was owed to my community at church as well. Like I met some really incredible women who are, around my age, maybe a little bit older, who really kind of instilled their values into me, and not because they were like teaching it at me, but because they just lived it, and they shared things about themselves that I was like, that's how I want to be, like
Mhm.
I want to follow that example. Like that's the kind of woman that I would like to be. So, let me start changing some things in my life to help me get to that place. And so since then it's really been about that. It's like, who do I want to be, and how can I work on being that person on a day-to-day basis?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing you said, which was positivity, is so huge, and then mindset. I mean, it's difficult to reframe your mind. If you're like so used to negativity and thinking a certain way and being pessimistic, making that switch can be really difficult. But it really comes down to the habits, like you mentioned, and training yourself and catching yourself whenever you're negative and flipping that into a positive somehow. And I think we all struggle with that from time to time, like we're not all perfect, and just forgiving ourselves, whenever we have, an incident like that.
Yeah.
So self-worth, what does self-worth look like?
Yeah. Before I jump into that question,
Mhm.
something you said about, forgiveness,
Mhm.
that's something that's really huge. And I think a lot of people skip over that,
Mhm.
forgiving yourself for being negative, in that example
Right.
is huge, because we might have an ambition or a goal to be positive or to have a certain mindset, but we are going to slip up. There's no
Mhm.
guarantee that even if you've learned it a million times, that you're going to be consistent with it, right? And if
Mhm.
we can't forgive ourselves, like you said, we end up having shame about it or guilt about it. And shame and guilt are one of the biggest killers of joy, in my opinion.
Mm.
And you get to, once you get into like a shame cycle, it starts to be like a downward spiral. So we do have
Mhm.
to learn how to forgive ourselves in various situations, so that way we can learn how to be kind to ourselves, which kind of does relate to self-worth, right?
Mhm.
Because if we don't consider ourselves worthy of forgiveness or worthy of kindness, we're not going to be able to show ourselves love. And at the end of the day, if we can't show ourselves love, we can't truly show other people love as well.
Mhm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a balance, like, as ambitious people, I would consider myself pretty ambitious, got big dreams, big goals, big vision. And so like you got to hold yourself to a high standard, to hit habits and like hit goals at the same time. But then on the opposite spectrum is like if you don't, do some of the things that you set out to do, it's okay, and forgiving yourself. So it's definitely a balance, it could be a tough balance if you're at the end of either extreme.
Yeah. Completely. Yeah. And I think that's really the crux of what I work on for myself and what I strive to help other people with too, because you're right. It is a difficult balance. It's like, where do you draw the line?
Hmm.
And, at the end of the day, it's just about picking yourself back up and dusting yourself off and realizing that you're not perfect and not expecting yourself to be perfect and not expecting other people to be perfect and continuing to take one step at a time.
Hmm. So how would you define that gray line? Like teaching, you teach people to accept themselves, self-worth, but then like you can't just do that all the time, right? Like you still have to strive to become better and improve as a person, and not accept all the, negative or bad things about you. So like, where do you draw that line and teach, women to draw that line?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's probably going to be different for each person. Because the things that I personally struggle with self-worth and forgiveness and my own goals is going to be different from yours. So, like I'll just explain in the context of my own situation, right? Because I am a perfectionist. That's kind of
Mm,
how I've grown up, is being a perfectionist and being an overachiever. And that's because of a myriad of different things from my childhood, how my mom raised me. My mom is very Asian mom. So
mm,
she definitely held me to a high standard. And that, that type of high standard was just kind of ingrained in me from a very young age. Now,
mhm,
with that kind of context in mind, it's now okay, like now I know my tendencies. And so once you know somebody's tendencies of where they start to go, whether it's be overachieving perfectionism, or maybe it's self-deprecation, maybe it's maybe it's like a low self-confidence in the fact of you never try to do something because you never
mhm,
think that you're going to be good at it. Those are two different types of people. But once you know that person's tendencies and you know that about yourself, then you can realize, okay, I know going into this job interview, I'm probably going to start thinking this, and this, or maybe you're already thinking
mm,
it, right? And so now you have a level of self-awareness that you didn't have before. And you can now self-diagnose yourself of like, all right, I'm leaning towards perfectionism right now, or I'm leaning towards self-deprecation. Why do I feel like I want to give up right now? I want to give up because of X, Y, and Z. And so why do I feel this way? And for me, it goes back to, hey, well, this is just how my brain was trained when
mhm,
I was very young. And so does that mean that I should be like this in this particular situation? Maybe not. That's a own personal conversation that you need to have with yourself, is to figure out, hey, what are the lies that I'm telling myself, or the lies that I'm hearing in my brain? And what is the truth actually in this situation? And also, even playing devil's advocate with yourself of what would happen if the worst thing happened, right?
mm,
How
mhm,
would that scenario play out? If
mhm,
I didn't get this job, what would actually happen? Well, I would need to go find another job, right? Is that so bad? No. Right? So you can start to have these conversations with yourself that allow you to realize that your overthinking, or your self-deprecation, or your low what's the word I'm looking for, like negative self-talk,
mm,
is not getting you anywhere great. It's not taking you another step forward. It's actually holding you back. So when we start to self-diagnose and recognize those things, then we can start to bring the truth to it, which is, I can get this job. I can.
mhm,
And if I don't, I can get another one. It doesn't define who I am as a person. I can do what I want to do. And even if this situation isn't the one for me, I can now take another step towards something that is going to be the right thing for me. And it's not a
mhm,
reflection of me. So it's all a practice, and none of this happens like super fast. But the more I always say that self-awareness is the first step. And the
mhm.
more self-awareness we can have, the more that we can start to untangle that mess in our heads that tends to crop up.
Right. Yeah, self-awareness is huge. And that's one of the, I would say, my weaknesses is self-awareness. And I definitely had to build it over time because I think for me, like I really don't care, what other people think. So like because I don't care, I think that kind of ties into like myself, and so it's important to understand, where my strengths are, where my weaknesses are, and play that out. So how do people like build self-awareness? Like when you are teaching women, like, hey, you got to be self-aware. What's kind of like a way that people can achieve that?
That's also a really great question. And first of all, I commend you for being honest about that, about yourself, that you don't have the greatest self-awareness. And I think that in itself is self-awareness, right? If
Hmm.
you are aware that you aren't completely self-aware, that is a level of self-awareness.
Oh yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah. And it is in those little steps that you recognize, okay, like you recognize something about yourself that is a weakness, and now you're aware of it. So when we're trying to teach people how to be more self-aware, it's all about metacognitive thinking. And what
Hmm.
metacognition is thinking about thinking. So you have to be a little bit more in tune with your thoughts. And so a lot of people aren't very in tune with their thoughts. And so that tends to be the first step of like, okay, you might be working. If you're working, how can you be a little bit more in tune with what you're thinking about while you're working? Because if you don't know what your thoughts are, you are not self-aware. So if you can start to recognize your thoughts of pick out, oh, I'm thinking about typing this letter, or, something simple, it could be something very simple about like, oh, I'm typing this, but yet I'm thinking about what I want to make for dinner. You're starting to recognize, okay, I'm actually thinking about something else than what
Hmm.
I'm doing here. So once you start to realize what your thoughts are, then you can start to pick out what are the positive things that you're thinking and what are the negative ones. And 9 times out of 10, you're going to figure out that you have an overwhelming amount of negative thoughts compared to positive ones, because that's how our brains are. There's been studies done on it that most of human thought is negative as opposed to
Hmm.
positive. And so that's normal. So if you start to realize that a lot of I'm saying some really mean things to myself right now, or I'm thinking some very bad things are going to happen, then it's normal and you don't have to freak out about it. But it's like now you have that awareness, right? You're aware of not only is this thought negative, but what is this thought about? Is it about myself? And tying back to self-worth is like, if you realize a lot of your thoughts are, negatively talking to yourself, then you're aware of it now. So it really just starts with being in tune with our thoughts, and it could be very small. And I think one way of learning how to do that is through meditation. A lot of people find meditation very difficult, though. So I think you can learn how to be aware of your thoughts even outside of meditation. But I do recommend it if you're able to. If you are having trouble with meditation for any reason, I really like to think about my thoughts while I'm driving,
Hmm.
or when I'm doing something kind of mindless like cooking or washing dishes, because you're busy in a way and you're doing something, your body is occupied, but it allows you to kind of go inward and really like tune into what's going on up here. And that's
Hmm.
really what meditation is. The only difference is meditation, you're typically just sitting down and doing nothing, and people have issues with that. So if you can do something a little bit mindless with your body and start to go inward and start to think a little bit more about what you're thinking, that can start to spur some self-awareness for you.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's so huge. Like I read a book called The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. That was in college. And one of the things he says is being aware of your thoughts, being an observer and just sitting back. And it's like almost like if you're sitting on a bench and you're just observing your thoughts go by, and you can start to see the negative ones, and some people aren't even aware that they have negative feelings. And then whenever something happens, like, they have this built-in emotion that comes out, they're reacting. But if you like start to be more aware of your thoughts, you can start to just focus on the positive ones and not be so almost in control of your emotions and your thoughts. So yeah, I think that's huge, having self-awareness. So you mentioned like your mom, held you to a high standard. Like, does she still do that? And do you like have conversations with her about it? Like, have you ever talked to her about it? Tell me about that.
Oh gosh, yeah. The good thing is now that I'm an adult and I'm very self-sufficient, she doesn't do this anymore. It was mostly, from, being a kid until I turned 18. 18 is when I started to like leave her house. And so
Mhm,
I started to get a little bit of freedom from that, which I
mhm,
really needed at the time because it was traumatic, honestly. Not just the high standards, but I mean, I come from a divorce family, so there was a lot of anger, a lot of fighting going on a regular basis. So
mm,
that was also very traumatic. But yeah, I have had a chance to talk to her about these things, and it has been healing, I would say, which is always good if you're able to share the past issues that you've had with a parent or a loved one, and it's received well, and it isn't gaslighted in any way, or it isn't, there isn't negative connotations brought up at that time. It can be a very healing experience. So since then, she she is now aware of just the standards that she's held for me, but it doesn't come up anymore, and she doesn't really do that so much. Her main concern now is just about my safety, and she seems to
mhm.
think that I don't know how to keep myself safe. But I think that's just like a normal like parent thing.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, that's my mom too. She's always concerned about safety. So, and that being said, like, and this could be a little controversial, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. I think as a society, we're doing a lot better, with like recognizing mental health, and that's a real thing. And, anxiety, depression, I feel like we're at a good place. I mean, of course, we can always improve, but I feel like we've, as a society, really recognized it and have been doing a lot, and sharing solutions for that. Now, I also think that sometimes people take it to the extreme, right? They might just be feeling stressed out, but then they use the term depression or they use the term anxiety, right? They're exacerbating the problem. And I think it's so important to be careful of the words that we tell ourselves and use, right? And so just like, if you're just thinking positively, or if you're thinking negatively, that's going to determine the outcome of your life. And so similar with words, if you're using like negative words all the time, that's going to determine how you feel. You might build a self-fulfilling prophecy where you're just more negative and negative, negative because you're using all these negative words. So how much do you think of like, if you had to put a number on it, like how many people do you think are just using the word anxiety and depression when they're just really stressed or a little, just had a bad day, versus actually being, having anxiety and depressed?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't quite put a number on it, but just because I don't know the research on that, it'd be really interesting if there is research about that, because you're 100% right that, our words do really affect the status of our mental health and the direction in which our life goes. So I wouldn't be able to put a number on it of how many people or the ratio of people who do that, but I have seen it in some of my friends' lives.
Mm,
And honestly, I don't think it's my job, or I don't even think it's, somebody else's job to tell them whether or not that they're clinically depressed or clinically anxious, unless that person is a psychologist and
mhm,
has experience in
right.
that field. So it's hard for me to even say or tell somebody whether or not they're in one direction or the other, just because I don't have the qualifications to tell somebody that.
Mhm,
However, I think what's important, whether you are clinically diagnosed with depression or anxiety or not, it is important, to your point, to talk about it in a way that conduces a healthy growth from it.
mm,
So,
mhm,
for example, I would recommend to people, if you're struggling with anxiety, for example, you can say, I struggle with anxiety, but I'm working on it. Or instead of saying I have anxiety or I have depression, saying I am working through anxiety, I am working through depression, because that although it's not happy-go-lucky positive, it is, hey, I am working on it, which is true. First of all, if it's a true thought, it's going to hold more weight for you. Second of all, it is emphasizing the fact that you are growing and you are working towards something that is a good goal in mind. So for any sort of, maybe diagnosis or, something that somebody might be going through that is negative, without invalidating the truth of that statement or without invalidating that person's truth, they can talk about it in a way that is positive and getting themselves through it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just had, a few people in a row, like on my podcast, bring up that, the words that you tell yourself and how important it is, and how it determines, your thinking and your thoughts and your feelings, and so one of the things, the last podcast person I interviewed, Matt Stewart, from College Works, he's like, oh, this stress I'm feeling, it's like, yeah, I'm working through it, but this stress is good. This is going to help me become a better person, deal with stress. Boom, like let it go. And like, almost like reframing each negative thought into a positive, and then letting it go, like confronting your thoughts straight on instead of just letting it fester inside you.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with that, is that you can't just ignore the thoughts. You can't just ignore the feelings that are coming up, because that tends to put like a Band-Aid on the solution, right? It just piles up, it piles up, it piles up, and then it's going to overflow at some point. I'm so guilty of this, by the way. If you ever want to know what happens to you if you just continuously like bury things, let me know. Definitely happened to me. But yeah, I think definitely confronting it and realizing like, okay, what is the truth of the situation? And I love that Matt Stewart talks about, okay, this stress is actually going to help me get better as a person. That was the truth that comes from it. And then now he can move forward in a better way. So absolutely agree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think people that do you think it's like a personality type, or do you think like, people that are a little bit more easygoing, not as like confrontational, are more likely to, do that to themselves, where they just kind of like shove down their emotion and thoughts? Like or do you think like everybody struggles with it? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a few factors that can go into why somebody might do that, or their inclination to want to do that. And I just, from speaking from personal experience, I'm very non-confrontational. I'm very like very easygoing. So I do fit in that category you described. And I think that did play a factor into why I started to bury things. I think another factor could be how that person was raised. And so if they grew up in a household where they didn't feel like they had a voice, or they didn't have, or if they didn't feel like they were going to be heard, or if they felt like their feelings and emotions didn't matter, that person is also very likely to want to bury things, because they've been trained to suppress. They've been trained to keep it in, because in their minds, nobody else would like to hear it. So that person is also going to struggle to open up to things. And there's probably some other factors that play into it as well. But I think personality is definitely one of them. How somebody was raised is another, and just the overall. Yeah. Oh, actually, I would also say like a socioeconomic status as well. So I think race can play into it. I think also gender can play into it, because I'll just speak from a gender perspective, right? Growing up, a lot of women heard, women are quiet, or, or women are slow to speak, or, there's certain language or things that were told to us when we were younger of, women are supposed to be like this.
Mm,
And there's also something about, since race is also a big factor in our society, is that, Black lives matter right now. Absolutely. But back then, or, before Black Lives Matter really became a thing, it's like they felt like they didn't have a voice to share things, a lot of
mm,
and of course that's changing and growing, and that's how it should be going. But it's like, if you were kind of taught those things, whether it be explicit or implicitly said, you are going to feel like you're going to have to suppress things for one
mm,
reason or the other. It could also be too for men. Like, men have, and you might have experienced this, men are often told like, oh, to be a man, you have to be strong, you have to be tough, you have to not show emotion, right? And so men typically will struggle with sharing their emotions, or actually working through those things, because they feel like they're not going to be manly if they
mm,
show vulnerability. So
mm.
there's a whole bunch of things that can go into it.
Yeah. I wonder if that's one of the reasons why, men are in the society are struggling. I see some of the numbers, like, a lot of men are committing suicide. A lot of men are falling into depression, alcoholism, drug overdoses. And I wonder if it's like one of those things where they're not used to, understand their emotions and expressing that.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I recently read this book called Daring Greatly by
Mhm.
Brene Brown, and it is all about vulnerability and
Mm,
in different contexts. And so she's a researcher who's studied vulnerability for years upon years. And so she shares a lot of her research and also, personal testimonies that she's found from either people in her life that have come forward and shared, and a lot of them are men, and they don't know how to process the emotions, like you said, and they also have trouble expressing it. So if you haven't had a lot of practice in recognizing your own emotions or
mhm,
even expressing them, it's going to be really, really hard, especially in adult age, after the point of which our brains have already developed. It's going to be really challenging to start to learn how to do that. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, but once you're an adult and you have responsibilities, you have all of these different things in your life that you have to now balance, it does become much harder to start to develop these tools and habits that can help you be in a place where you're safe and you feel like you're safe to be able to express yourself. So that's one reason why I think therapy is super important, because it is supposed to create a safe space for you. Because a
mhm,
lot of men especially don't feel very comfortable sharing things with their wives, because in their heads they feel like in order to be the man in the relationship, or in order to be a husband, they need to be the strong one and they can't show emotion. And unfortunately, that stereotype is perpetuated by women and wives also. So
mm,
a lot of men don't feel 100% comfortable sharing things with their wives sometimes, because they feel like she might think less of them, which may or may not
mm,
be true. But regardless, that man needs to feel safe in the environment in which he's being vulnerable. So therapy does create that environment in which he can start to express himself and become comfortable sharing his emotions and working through that. And once he feels like he is safe, then he can feel more comfortable coming to his wife with that.
mhm. Yeah, I think that's powerful. That is some deep stuff. And I can definitely relate, like, even, it's almost like society has hit you with it so many times that it's kind of like ingrained in your back of your head, and you have to like retrain your brain to not think that certain way. Um yeah, I think as men, like, you're told to not show emotion, you're told to be strong, like you said, to to be like the rock, the rock of the relationship. And so, like, yeah, that might be why they're not comfortable. Many men are not comfortable sharing, their emotions and being vulnerable with their wives. So I could
Yeah.
definitely see that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a problem for sure. And I think both genders go through issues with this in different ways, and it manifests differently for different couples, just depending on their history and how they've grown up, and just the dynamics between the relationship. So it's always something that needs to be aware of first, and then worked through in a way that's helpful for both parties.
Mhm. And I think even just therapy in general, I feel like a lot of men, might feel a certain way, when they hear therapy, like, oh, I don't need that stuff, like I don't need to share my emotions and my problems with someone else, and it goes back to that vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And it's great that, we're talking about it here on this podcast, and, we're talking about it in mass media a little bit more. Is like mental health is becoming more normalized to have, or sorry, mental health illnesses and, just issues with mental health are more accepted, and more understood a little bit more. And then therapy is becoming normalized. So
Mhm.
whenever I come across anybody who says, oh, I love therapy, or, or like therapy is so great, I ask them, do you go to therapy?
Mhm.
And it's so funny, Fong. Most of them will be like, no, I have never gone there. And it
That's
cracks
funny.
me up. It cracks me up sometimes, because it's like, hey, I'm glad that you feel very positive about it. That's the first step. But in order to fully get the benefits from the change in the narrative, we actually have to go. We
Mm.
have to put in the work and put ourselves in those vulnerable situations, or else nothing actually changes, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's really interesting. Hmm. So, regarding like, let's kind of deep dive a little bit more into that. So you go to therapy, you meet with a psychologist, psychiatrist, and you kind of work through your problems. I'm just thinking like, what, are all, like I start to question, like, are all psychologists good? Like just like doctors, not every doctor is good. Like if you go to your doctor and let's say you're overweight, a good doctor would be like, hey, like here are some problems that could happen if you're overweight. Let's figure out how we can create a healthier lifestyle, right? And then I could see some doctors like being afraid of just telling someone, that they need to lose weight, right? And that in my opinion, would be a bad doctor because they're not doing that person a service, to tell them the truth of what needs to happen. And so with psychologists, like I sometimes wonder if like all of them are, you know, actually having a tough conversation, with their patients or not,
Yeah,
And I could
absolutely.
totally be off here. Yeah, just kind of talking out.
No,
And I
I mean,
just,
you're 100% right. Yeah, there's definitely a level of skill that goes into either a counselor, psychologist, psychiatrist, whatever part of the spectrum they fall
Mhm.
into. And depending on which niche, I think is also important to know too, because some psychiatrists or psychologists fall into like marriage counseling, or
Mm.
sex therapy, and others fall into the category of trauma and abuse and PTSD, so it's also knowing the different niches that somebody can fall into, and making sure that you're going to somebody who's in the correct niche.
Mhm.
The other factor that I've personally experienced with therapy is it's kind of like dating. You
Mm.
have to go and check out a bunch of different therapists and figure out if that person's right for you. And it doesn't necessarily reflect on their skill level sometimes. A lot of the times it's a matter of personality. It's a matter of being
Mm.
able to relate. And, for example, if you are a Black woman, and you have a therapist that is a white man, you might not be able to, or he might not be able to relate to you as much as if you were to go to a Black woman therapist, right?
Mm.
Now there are some rare situations. Like I have a friend who is part Indian, part Pakistani, part Iranian, and she goes to a white male therapist, and that
Mhm.
therapist is really great for her. So although the
Mm.
cultural backgrounds doesn't necessarily match up, he has a very great skill that is
Mhm.
of value to her. And the
Right.
only way that she was able to know that is if she went to go see him in the first place. And
Mhm.
if the last people or the last therapist that she went to wasn't actually helping her.
Mhm.
And so for me personally, I've had an experience where I've had mostly great experiences with therapy, and I've had great therapists that have always been able to help me. Aside from one, I had one that I got from BetterHelp.com, which is a very incredible app to get virtual therapy. And I gave her, I think, maybe 3 sessions, and I think it's important to give people a chance because the first session is always just more of like a get to know you type of session. And
Mhm.
you might know whether or not that person is right for you, but giving them a couple chances to really show you who they are and how they intend to help you is important. But I decided to cut her off just because I felt like she wasn't actually listening to me. And
Mm.
with therapy, especially, listening is super key. If
Mhm.
you're able to make the client or the patient feel like they're being heard, being seen, and you're able to not only show that, but be able to give, I'm not going to say give advice because giving advice is actually not what therapists are supposed to do. um,
Mhm.
they're supposed to help lead you to a solution. And if that
Mhm.
person isn't able to lead you to a solution that works for you, then that shouldn't be a therapist for you.
Mm.
And sometimes that is a skill level thing, right?
Mhm.
Because this particular therapist, I felt like she wasn't listening to me because she would just talk at me all the time and she
Mm.
wouldn't ask me questions, which is huge. That I think that's a big
Mhm.
indicator to know whether or not a therapist has the right skill level is do they ask more questions than they talk?
Mhm.
Because that's a huge thing. I think that's a blanket statement for all therapists,
Right.
no matter what field you're in. But yes, if they take time to ask questions more than they speak, that is a good sign that they know what they're doing. Another thing is to really evaluate what are the exercises or what is the homework that they're giving you. And
Mm.
if you don't feel like it matches, or if you don't feel like at least in the next session it helps you feel better in a certain way, then, or if it doesn't help resolve the problem that you guys have decided you're going to work on, then that's also a sign that they're probably misaligned and they might be using more I don't know, templated things.
Mm.
Like that particular therapist was giving me these exercises that had nothing to do with what I expressed were my concerns. so
Mhm.
so that was very interesting to me because I was like, okay, number one, you're not really listening. Number two, you're giving me stuff that's kind of like, it feels like busy work. It doesn't feel like it's actually helping. And I'm telling you what I need help with very explicitly, and you're not doing that. So I think the biggest thing is, being able to feel like you're heard and you're understood is foundational for a therapist.
Mhm. Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think what you're describing is empath, they call it empathetic listening, and there's like so many different levels to listening. And so some people, they listen, they're kind of hearing you, but they're thinking of their next response, and so it might come across as they're talking at you. And so empathetic listening is like truly having no agenda. Your thoughts are just totally listening to that other person. You're feeling what they're feeling. And then like you don't have, sometimes you might not have a response right then and there. And you wait a few seconds to really think about what they said, and then you reply. So yeah, I could see why that would be so important in a therapist.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially for somebody who's going through mental health challenges, right? A lot of people, like the reason why they go to therapy is because they don't feel like they're heard in other situations,
Hmm.
whether that be in their family life or friends or whoever it is in their life. And so they
Hmm.
need somebody to actually show them that they're heard and that they have a voice.
Right.
So absolutely.
Absolutely. Mhm. So speaking about like just talking to people and like listening to them, I mean, I'm sure you do that a lot on your podcast, listening to your guests and their expertise. So have you had any particular discussion with your guests where maybe they changed your paradigm or they said something that deeply impacted you?
Yeah, I feel like almost every single guest I have changes my mindset in some way, or teaches me something that's really important, um and something that I can really take with me as I go along. And I think it's those conversations that are really impactful for the show and also for my own personal journey, because I tend to ask questions that are, it applies to my audience, yes, but it also applies to me because I'm very curious about a lot of things in this person's life. And,
Hmm.
I'm curious what their journey has been and how they, kind of similar to the questions you're asking in your podcast. And, I think there's always a level of curiosity that yields something new. If you're open to being curious and you're open to, um, kind of understanding somebody else's journey, you're going to take away something that impacts you and that helps you out. I had a really great conversation with Alicia Gwynn. She's the wife of the late and great Tony Gwynn from the San Diego Padres.
Hmm.
And she's older. I can't tell you how old she is, but she's an older woman. But she was talking a lot about character, and she was talking about, she calls it the ABCs of character, and it's how
Hmm.
she navigates life. And the first one being her attitude, the second one being behavior, and C, I can't remember off the top of my head, but her attitude, behavior, and her thoughts ultimately were how she was able to carry herself so well, being the
Hmm.
wife of somebody famous. And she's a very ambitious woman herself. She has, I don't even know how many businesses, at least 3 or 4. And she has written a book, and she's, has done a whole bunch of charity work as well. And so being like activating and living at such a high level, and knowing that that person also really pays attention to their attitude, their behavior, and, works to heal and to develop themselves on the inside before they do on the outside, that really impacted me, because it's like, okay, that's something that I was doing, but it's something, hearing it from somebody who is a lot older and a lot farther in their journey kind of helps solidify that or emphasize it in a
Hmm.
way that allows you to have more confidence in what you're doing. So that for me stood out.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so powerful. Attitude, thoughts, behaviors. I start to think like, it's almost like a muscle, like if you go to the gym and you go pretty consistently, you're building all this muscle, and then you don't go for months, weeks, years, your muscles start to deflate, you start to lose muscle, right? So what if, like, with these working on your attitudes, your behaviors, your thoughts, like you do it for so long and then you fall off, it's like you start to go back to losing, having a positive attitude, losing having positive behaviors that are going to help your life, losing the positive thoughts, and you go back to the negativity, because we're, like you said, most of our thoughts are inherently negative, right? And so I start to think about that, and like, I've fallen off from that, from time to time. And then now, like, I feel like I start to fall off the past year or two, and then I'm starting to get back into it, and so recognizing that, and learning from people like yourself, and surrounding myself with other positive people, is could be really helpful too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would arguably say your community, or the people you surround yourself with, is the most important thing to influencing you in a direction, whether it be positive or negative. So you're right. Yeah, if we fall off in any sort of way, the easiest and the best way to get back on track is to surround yourself with people who have a positive mindset, or just even listening to podcasts, listening to positive YouTube videos,
Hmm.
positive music. Anything that we input into our brains is going to influence us in one way or the other. So and that's important for a time and day and age where negative media is so persistent. Granted, there is a lot of positive media out there, but whatever algorithm you're subscribing to, whether on purpose or not on purpose, is going to feed you. So if
Mhm.
you're subscribing to the negative media, it's going to continue to pop up on your feed, and that's going to continue to feed your brain, and that'll be the feed of your brain, right? So
Mhm.
that's something that we have to be very aware of.
Yes, absolutely. So, to wrap up, like, you talk to so many different women, you kind of see the struggles, some women struggle with this, some with something else. So if you had to give like one piece of advice to like women that are struggling out there, like what would your piece of advice be that you feel like would make the most positive impact in their lives?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot that I could say. But I'll go back to the thing that really breaks my heart. The thing that really breaks my heart is seeing women in a place where they feel stuck, where they cannot move, or they feel like they don't have the ability to move. And whether that be a relationship, a job, a family life, friendships, it could be anything. If you feel like you're stuck and you cannot move, I would first just say you're not alone. And I've been there. A lot of other women have been there. And it's a place that you can get out of, is the first thing. You can get out of there. And I would challenge you to really marinate on it, because if you aren't able to believe that you're able to get unstuck, you are going to be stuck for a very long time. And I just want to tell you and really encourage you that you 100% can get out of that difficult situation that you're in. It's just going to take baby steps. And it might not happen tomorrow. It might not happen next week. It might not happen next month. It might not happen next year. But you know what? As long as you keep on taking those steps one by one, you can get yourself to a place where you can look back at where you've been and realize that you're out of that place, or you're so much further from the dark place that you were in, that now you have more confidence to continue walking forward and to continue going in that direction. So that's my biggest advice that I could give, is to really keep on going, take the baby steps, and believe that you can get unstuck.
Wow, that is so powerful. What a great way to end. Thank you so much, Kiani, for being on. Where can people find you?
Thanks, Phong. Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram at growing to be Kiani, all spelled out. And my name is spelled Kiani. And that's really where I post everything. So I have a lot of travel content as well. I'm a world traveler. So I post about the podcast, about self-development, mental health, and also traveling. And you can find the podcast. It's called Grow to Be Free. And it's on anywhere that you find podcasts. So I'm sure Fong will put some links in the show notes or something like that where you can find it. But yeah, I also have a free 10-minute reset. It's a guided meditation that you can get for free. And what it is, it's a video that can help guide you through a meditative practice for about 10 minutes. And it's called a reset because it's for people who experience a lot of overwhelm, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, and it helps you to reset your mind. So that way you can move forward throughout your day or throughout the evening, whenever you're listening to it, with a reset mind. So that way you can be more positive and also have a clear mind ahead of you, and you can start to get stuff done. So I'm sure we'll also have that link in the show notes as well, so you can get that for free.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kiani. Thank you, everybody, for listening or watching. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.